Good evening. I'm Alexis Clyburn and you're watching Media Minutes. On today's segment, I will be discussing the global media coverage of the recent global climate change agreement known as the Paris Agreement. If you don't know what the Paris Agreement is, well, that's okay. Amidst the election coverage this past year, big news media just didn't have enough airtime to discuss it. Basically, the Paris Agreement is an agreement within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that covers mitigations on the issues of greenhouse gas emissions, how to adopt those mitigations, and the financing regarding the possible changes. Despite the scientific consensus regarding climate change and the undeniable effect carbon emissions have on the climate, governments around the world have yet to act. This is what the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change sought to change. Since the 1990s, the UNFCCC has held annual meetings to keep developing countries' greenhouse gas emissions to a reasonable level. The UN representatives in the UNFCCC have had trouble enacting the right agreement to make a change, until December 2015, when the representatives in the UNFCCC adopted the Paris Agreement. In terms of reversing climate change and helping peripheral countries, the ones who are most at risk if greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise and heat the planet, the Paris Agreement is the best shot we have. The considerations that had to be met for the Paris Agreement to go into effect were met this November. However, the problem is the foreign and even domestic media coverage of the Paris Agreement. Before I go into my analysis of the different news articles, I will discuss the political situation and freedom of the press in the various regions that have signed the Paris Agreement and have covered the agreement in their news media. First, I will discuss the United States. Under the Obama administration, the United States ratified the Paris Agreement. As one of the world's leaders in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, it was globally important for the United States to ratify the agreement. However, before the agreement was ratified, climate change was not a priority for the American government. For a country with tremendous ties to the oil, gas, and coal industry, it's hard to break away from the lobbying and enforce a climate change agreement that actually makes a difference. News media in the United States is mostly privately owned. Whether the owners of the certain media conglomerates have ties to the oil, gas, coal, or even renewable energy sector severely shape how the public thinks about and discusses climate change, also known as the public agenda, and therefore how the government reacts to the public agenda, also known as the policy agenda. The same cannot necessarily be said for other countries such as China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. For example, China's news media does not have the same freedoms as the United States. China has one of the worst reputations when it comes to media coverage and censorship. If the news media coverage does not depict the country or government in a positive light, it is quickly censored. This is particularly interesting when it comes to climate change, well, because China has some of the most detrimental pollution in the entire world. For the Chinese people and the smaller Asian countries around China, it is important for the Chinese news media to cover the Paris Agreement and climate change in a realistic and truthful way. However, with the current restrictions, that has proven to be difficult. The same goes for Russia. Most Russian television and news media is government or state-controlled. TASS, which is a Russian news agency, is wholly owned by the Russian federal government. RT, on the other hand, while still funded by the Russian government, is owned by a separate company. Even the private companies that own news media in Russia have ties to the Kremlin. Despite their aim to report global news, it is all from a Russian perspective. Russia is also leader in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, it was very important for Russia to get on board with the Paris Agreement. With their current global relationship, it is no surprise that it has taken them longer than any other emissions leader to ratify the Paris Agreement. Nor is it a surprise that the coverage of the Paris Agreement is less than favorable. On the other hand, Indian news like the Indian Express or the Times of India is rather free compared to other countries. India has rather democratic freedom of expression laws. The Constitution does not necessarily mention the press or news media, however, it does provide for freedom of speech and expression. Although government officials and courts do not necessarily uphold these laws at all times, news media is still free to report on what they deem necessary. One caveat, that they do not promote hatred or contempt towards the government. The same can sort of be said for Arab media. Although Arab media has a history of being controlled or owned by the government or Arab regimes, most Arab media is now somewhat free. Despite the freedom of the press dynamic in Arab media, backlash from what is covered is still possible. Al Jazeera, although not directly controlled by the Qatari government, it is owned and funded by it. Despite the channel's willingness to report on the issues other channels choose not to, many audiences still believe that they have a bias towards Muslim and Arab perspectives. Arab news, while not owned specifically by the Saudi Arabian government, it is owned by a member of the House of Saud, the ruling royal family of Saudi Arabia. This connection can definitely affect the coverage and, well, the audience's perception of the coverage. The most important thing to maintain the Paris Agreement's legitimacy in each region or country is to portray the agreement's legitimacy accurately through the media. To help analyze the coverage of the Paris Agreement in various countries and regions, I developed the following research questions. How does each news article frame the country and its relationship with the Paris Agreement? And how does news media framing affect the public's perception of the agreement? In order to analyze the coverage of the Paris Agreement in various regions, I collected 11 articles from various foreign and domestic news sources. I collected 4 articles from online news sources, CBS News, Washington Post, Huffington Post, and Fox News, 2 articles from Indian news sources, The Times of India and the Indian Express, 2 articles from Russian news sources, TASS and RT, 2 articles from Arab news media, Al Jazeera and Arab News, and 1 article from a Chinese news source, Xinhuanet. All of these articles were published between December 2015 and November 2016. I decided to procure articles from these countries or regions because they are regions who are the ones who emit the most greenhouse gases, and also because the United States and China are core nations. What they report and choose as important news has a huge effect not only on their citizens and government, but governments around the world. We will see examples of this further in analysis. I will begin my analysis by defining 2 important theories in mass communication: agenda setting theory and framing theory. Basically, agenda setting theory is the idea that media controls the saliency of certain topics in the public agenda, therefore influencing what the public thinks and communicates about. In other words, media does not necessarily dictate what the public thinks, just what topics they think about and consider important. Framing theory is based on the idea that media uses certain words, images, and styles to communicate certain events and stories to the audience. How they frame an event or story severely affects the perception of the current event or story. Although American media is not as censored as other regions, U.S. media still has the ability to cover certain topics and frame these topics in a certain manner. Because U.S. media is so unrestricted, it is more about what they choose not to cover than what they do cover. Left-center media, such as the Washington Post and Huffington Post, frame the Paris Agreement in a more opinionated tone. This can clearly be perceived as bias towards audience who do not agree with the news. But it shows the audience that they have a stance on the issue, that there actually is an issue. Whereas other news media, such as CBS News and Fox News, prefer to report the facts of the agreement. Although the public needs facts, framing a story around just the facts of the agreement does not seriously portray the historic importance of this agreement, or even the fact that climate change is something that the United States is partially responsible for. The Times of India combines the frames that the U.S. media uses to develop the story. While they still reveal the facts of India's ratification of the Paris Agreement, they simultaneously frame the agreement in a positive light while framing the ramifications of the agreement in a less than positive light. It is a positive spin that could make certain readers resentful of the agreement. They show respect for certain Indian lifestyles, Gandhian lifestyles, while readers who live alternate lifestyles, extravagant lifestyles per se, could be disrespected by the frame. The Indian Express doesn't hesitate to provide information on other countries. With India's history of media and their relationship reporting on other countries, it is sort of surprising that they decided to report on Saudi Arabia's relationship with the Paris Agreement. Even more surprising is that they decided to frame Saudi as a relationship in a less than positive light. The 2 Russian articles I decided to analyze are similar in ownership and distribution, but they differ in their styles. I would say this difference in ownership greatly affects the frames in which the news agency delivers their news. Right off the bat, TASS delivers their news of the Paris Agreement with the headline, "Haste with Paris Climate Change Agreement Deal. Ratification is caused by Paris." The 2 Russian articles I decided to analyze are similar in ownership and distribution, but they differ in news styles. I would say this difference in ownership greatly affects the frames in which the news agency delivers their news. Right off the bat, TASS delivers their news of the Paris Agreement with the headline, "Haste with Paris Climate Change Deal Ratification is caused by U.S. pressure." To readers with little knowledge of the Paris Agreement or even climate change, and who have great national pride, just the headline frames the agreement in a very negative way. It frames the Paris Agreement as a deal that has only been ratified by so many countries only because of U.S. pressure. The article makes it a point that the Paris Agreement is not something that needs to be quickly ratified by Russia or any other government for that matter. However, RT covers their agreement by discussing the environmentalist protests that occurred following the development of the agreement in 2015. The article didn't blatantly state that the agreement was weak. However, by covering the protesters' opinions that the government is weak, that the agreement is weak, they can inadvertently frame the agreement in a negative way. Although it's not the same negative frame as TASS, it can still affect the public's perception of the Paris Agreement. Lastly, because the Chinese news media has such heavy restrictions on what they can cover and how they cover it, it is rare for news to frame a story around negative representation of the government. The article from Xinhua News, the official news agency of the People's Republic of China, discusses their own country's ratification of the Paris Agreement. Despite China being a leader in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and pollution, the article neither discusses this negative fact nor does it say anything else negative about the agreement. The article frames the Paris Agreement around how much good China's ratification of it has done. It is not about how positive the Paris Agreement is on the earth, but how positive China's ratification of the agreement is. Although the agenda the media is trying to project isn't bad, the coverage just doesn't give a clear sense of the agreement or the reasoning of the agreement. In conclusion, many communication scholars have studied agenda setting theory and framing theory. There is ample evidence to support that the theories that news media have a huge impact on how audiences view and think about a certain topic or event. Also, that media uses certain techniques to alter the impact that media undeniably has. When discussing climate change and the Paris Agreement, it is important to understand the history that governments have with the topic before analyzing how they cover the topic. Different news media outlets cover the event in a variety of ways with different framing techniques. But one thing is for sure, how these news media outlets cover the Paris Agreement severely affects how the public and audiences it reaches reacts to and thinks about the Paris Agreement. I'm Alexis Clyburn, and thank you for watching Media Minutes.